Well, I think there are two major challenges which are actually so serious that they literally endanger survival of the species. The worst of them, which is unfortunately rarely discussed, is the threat of nuclear war, which has been high for a long time, is now increasing. It's not alarmist when someone like Robert McNamara writes an article called Apocalypse Soon, or when leading strategic analysts in the most conservative journals talk of the appreciable risk of ultimate doom, primarily driven by what's called the transformation of the military in the United States, the vast increase in offensive military capacity, including steps towards militarization of space, which every analyst understands, is leading potential adversaries to increase their own offensive military capacities. The Russians have done so very substantially since the Bush administration came in. The Chinese are now doing it. And all of these systems are increasingly being placed on automated response systems, hair trigger alert, what's called an accident waiting to happen in the strategic analysis literature. We know our own systems fail constantly and are aborted by human intervention, which has only a few minutes time. And the systems of adversaries are much less sophisticated and much more likely to cause an accidental missile strike. Those dangers are going up very high, and the talk about ultimate doom and apocalypse now is not alarmist. In fact, at a lower level, U.S. intelligence analysts estimate the probability of a dirty nuclear bomb attack in the United States in the next 10 years at about 50%. That's not a massive nuclear attack, but enough to change the course of history dramatically and maybe lead the way to nuclear war. These are things that are right at the edge, and instead of doing something about them, we're going in the opposite direction.
How do you square your fears about potential nuclear annihilation with your very strong opposition to the invasion of Iraq? Because, I mean, whatever turned out to be the case with intelligence, there isn't really any doubt, is there, that Bush, followed by Blair, did launch the invasion of Iraq because of the fear that Saddam Hussein might be getting his hands on weapons of mass destruction.
Well, that's what they claimed, yes. And within a few months it was determined that that claim had to be abandoned. But it was predicted in advance, and it is now understood, that the invasion of Iraq would increase the threat of nuclear proliferation as well as the threat of terror. And in fact, both have happened. As far as nuclear proliferation was concerned, the invasion simply taught a lesson to any potential adversary. You had better develop a nuclear deterrent. Otherwise, the United States and Britain will attack you if they think you're defenseless. And that lesson's been learned.
Do you think then that there are no circumstances in which military means are justified to prevent a ruthless psychopath getting his hands on nuclear weapons?
Yeah, plenty. In fact, you could say that about all the nuclear states, whether military means are necessary to eliminate nuclear weapons. But your question presupposes that the goal of the invasion was to prevent a ruthless psychopath from getting his hands on weapons of mass destruction. There was never any evidence for that in the first place to speak of, and now we know that it was totally false. So this was a ruthless military invasion for quite different purposes. Bush and Blair went to war on the basis of what they called a single question, reiterated over and over. Will Saddam give up his weapons of mass destruction program? The answer to that was given within a few months. There weren't any. And then suddenly, dramatically, the picture changed. The dogma changed. It wasn't weapons of mass destruction. We entered Iraq because of what the press calls Bush's messianic mission to bring democracy to Iraq and the Middle East. Well, okay, that's now the mantra in the West, but not elsewhere. So, for example, shortly after Bush made a dramatic pronouncement in Washington about the messianic mission to great acclaim, there was a poll taken in Baghdad where people were asked why the U.S. invaded Iraq. 1% said that it was to bring democracy. 5% said that it was to help Iraqis. The rest said something we're not allowed to say. Blair calls it a conspiracy theory, but what everybody who has a brain functioning knows. Yes, the U.S. and Britain are invaded to take control of Iraq's enormous energy resources and to fortify their position of domination of the world's major energy resources.
Could you just elaborate on that? Because, of course, it's been said many times before, and as you point out, many Iraqis believe that is the case. But how has it actually improved the U.S. dominance of world oil? I mean, Iraq is not pumping any more than it did under Saddam Hussein. Saddam was quite happy to sell oil to the Americans. How has America actually benefited from its adventure in Iraq in terms of dominating world oil markets?
First of all, that's a misunderstanding which confuses access and control. The U.S. has long been concerned to control energy resources, not to access them. So for the first 30 years after the Second World War, the U.S. North America was the major oil producer. It didn't use Middle East oil resources. Nevertheless, it was dedicated to control them. We know that very well, even from the internal record and from policy. And the same is true now. Intelligence projections are that the U.S. will itself rely on Atlantic Basin resources, more stable ones, Western Hemisphere, West Africa, but will control Middle East resources because they give critical leverage over U.S. competitors, Europe and Asia. Now, your point about not succeeding in that is correct. This was one of the most astonishing military failures in history. And nobody can think of anything like it. It should have been the easiest invasion in history, and the incompetence and arrogance of the Pentagon planners turned it into a total catastrophe. So yes, it hasn't worked out the way they wanted, but that has nothing to do with their plans. And that would be like saying that Hitler didn't intend to conquer the world because he failed. It turned into a military catastrophe. They actually succeeded in creating an insurgency which didn't exist. There was no basis for it, had no outside support. And in fact, the United States and Britain were compelled to allow elections. The elections in Iraq are a triumph of mass, popular, nonviolent resistance. Washington and London tried in every way they could to evade elections. You go back through 2003, there was one after another scheme proposed to try to avoid elections, but they couldn't do it. There was mass demonstrations, partially led by Ayatollah Sistani. Finally, they had to back down and allow elections. Now they're trying in every way to subvert them. But yes, they have not yet accomplished their goals. Doesn't change the fact that those were the goals.
So you accept, do you, that some good has come out of the Iraqi invasion, whether intended or not? I mean, the situation we have now with, as you say, successful elections, all communities in Iraq participating, is that a better place for Iraq to be than it was under Saddam Hussein?
We have to disentangle ourselves from rigid Western doctrine in order to talk about this sensibly. Iraq was suffering under two brutal regimes, before the invasion. One of them we're allowed to talk about, Saddam's tyranny. The second brutal regime was the US-UK sanctions regime, which had killed hundreds of thousands of people, devastated the society, strengthened the tyrant, and compelled the population to rely on him for survival. Otherwise, Saddam probably would have gone the way of other equally murderous and brutal tyrants supported by the U.S. and Britain, like Ceausescu and Suharto and Mobutu and a whole Marcos, a long list of others, to which new names are being added. But the society was devastated, and that sanctions regime was indeed ended by the invasion, so that's a step forward. Also, Saddam was eliminated, step forward. The U.S. has been compelled to allow elections. That's a step forward. But does that justify the aggression? I mean, that's outlandish. I mean, take, say, Japan's invasion of the Asian mainland. I mean, that had beneficial effects. It drove the white man out of Asia, led to independence in the Asian colonies, probably saved tens of millions of lives in India alone. That once the British were driven out, there weren't any of these huge famines that were taking place. Does that justify Japan's aggression? Obviously not.
You equated a bit earlier what the Bush administration has been doing or trying to do with Hitler. Do you believe that the United States, especially under its current administration, is particularly or uniquely amoral, or is it just a matter of whichever country wields the power will perforce act in that kind of way?
First of all, I did not equate the United States with Hitler in any respect whatsoever. I said that we don't justify atrocities on the basis of the fact that they sometimes have good effects, giving the example of Japan. That's not an equation. Is this administration radically different from others? Not so much. The political spectrum is pretty narrow, but this administration does happen to be at an extreme end of it. That's why there has been such forceful criticism of its actions from the beginning, right within the mainstream. I mean, take the invasion of Iraq. The plans to invade Iraq were bitterly criticized right in the leading establishment journals, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and so on. That's very unusual. They rarely criticize administration policy that sharply.
Do you think the mess that the Bush administration has got itself into in Iraq has reduced its enthusiasm for the neocon policy of full spectrum dominance?
Well, first of all, it's not a neocon policy. Clinton had the same policy. Just read the 1995 Strategic Command document, Essentials of Cold War Deterrents. That's Clinton. It's as extreme as anything the Bush people have said. These are long-standing policies. The catastrophe they created in Iraq has reduced substantially their capacity to carry out military intervention anywhere else. And what's more, they don't know how to get out of it. I mean, there's a lot of talk about withdrawal from Iraq, but it's mostly meaningless until we free ourselves from Western doctrine. We are supposed to believe that the United States and Britain would have invaded Iraq even if the major oil resources of the world were in Central Africa and Iraq was producing lettuce and pickles. Well, that's the doctrine, the religious doctrine that we are supposed to worship. As soon as we get out of that, we see that there's very good reason why the U.S. is quite unwilling to withdraw from Iraq. Suppose that a sovereign, independent, relatively democratic Iraq emerged. Just consider its policies, likely policies. The first thing it would do, it's already doing, is it'll have a Shiite majority. It'll create closer links with Iran, as it's already doing. A large majority of the clerics come from there. The Badr Brigade, which is militia that's pretty much running the south, was trained in Iran. And they'd much prefer close relations with their large Shiite neighbor than hostile ones. Furthermore, there's a Shiite population in Saudi Arabia, right across the border. Moves towards independence in Iraq will stimulate them. They have been under very harsh repression by the U.S.-backed fundamentalist tyranny. And of course, they're moving towards they want more freedom, and an independent Iraq will increase it. That happens to be where most of Saudi Arabian oil is. So you can imagine what must be the ultimate nightmare in Washington, an independent, loose Shiite alliance, independent of Washington, controlling the bulk of the world's oil, and probably turning toward the east, toward the Asian security energy grid, which is based in China and Russia, but is bringing in India and others. But the United States, it's hard to imagine the U.S. tolerating that. But those are likely consequences of a sovereign, democratic Iraq. And that's why the U.S. and Britain are so desperately seeking to prevent it.
What about the effects of all this on the United States itself? Well, we've just seen another instance of civil liberties being eroded with the electronic surveillance of citizens without court authorization. How dangerous to the freedom of Americans is Mr. Bush's so-called war on terror?
It's dangerous, but we should not underestimate achievements that have been won in the United States in protecting civil liberties and freedom of speech and general civil rights. In this respect, the United States is, I think, alone in the world. It has the highest standard of protection of freedom of speech of any country that I know, well, beyond Britain, for example. And those achievements are the results of centuries of struggle. They were not in the Bill of Rights. They were not granted from above. So the high standard for freedom of speech was established by the Supreme Court in the course of the Civil Rights Movement. And that's pretty deeply ingrained in people's consciousness. So when the Bush administration tried to gain FBI access to libraries around the country, and these are pretty conservative places, small libraries in the Midwest, they simply refused. Many of them just destroyed their records. rather than have the FBI look at them.